All right, so we are actually approaching the end of Washington's term in office. As the first president, he had to go through and really set a number of standards and lay down a number of precedents that would really be the standard for the next, couple hundred years, with very few exceptions to what he had done. But you have to remember that even though we are getting close to the end of Washington's term in office, we're still dealing with both France and England. And in a last ditch attempt to try and avert war, President Washington sends John Jay to England to essentially work something out. Okay, he wants to remain neutral, but he cannot look away from the fact that Britain is seizing American shipping, impressing American sailors, and things like that. And so Jay is sent essentially to try and get England to pretty much cut it out, there, for lack of a better term. We don't really have a lot that we can negotiate or bargain with, but we are going to make the attempt anyway to try and appeal to England to avert the war that seems to be growing, at least in some quadrants of the nation right now. So Jay is sent to England, but his negotiations were actually sabotaged by Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton was, for lack of a better term, pro-British, whereas Jefferson was pro-France. So you can see that each individual was really working toward their own ends on what they thought was going to be best. Okay, so Hamilton actually gives Britain details of what our strategy is. This could easily be interpreted as a act of treason in that you are giving essentially state secrets to another nation. So as a result of Britain knowing what our bargaining strategy was, what we were willing to give, what we wanted out of the bargain, etc. Since they already knew what cards were being held by our nation, it gave them a significant advantage in negotiating any kind of treaty. And we did end up with a treaty. It's referred to as Jay's Treaty, named after John Jay. But the problem is that even though we did get a treaty and so therefore averted war, the results were not pretty. Okay, we went through and we were bargaining at a disadvantage. England was bargaining at a great advantage, and they used that advantage as any nation would, or as any person would. If you have inside information that will benefit you in a negotiation, human nature tends to be, we're going to use that. And that's exactly what happened here. So the results, like I said, they were not pretty. Okay, for example, Britain would repay the money that had been lost from recent merchant ship seizures. Okay, remember, they were going through, they were boarding American flagged vessels, they were seizing cargo, they were impressing sailors, and they basically agreed, look, we'll make that right. We will pay for the stuff that we took. Okay. However, there was nothing at all said about any kind of future seizures. It wasn't as if they said, okay, we were wrong, we won't do that anymore. They basically said, look, we'll pay for what we've already done. There was no promise that it was going to stop. It was just going to be a payment for what had already occurred. Plus, there was nothing said about no longer supplying arms to the various Indian groups. So really, Britain in this treaty didn't really have a whole lot to have to give up. They never promised they would quit seizing American shipping, and they never promised to quit giving arms to the Indians that were then being used to attack Americans. Really, Britain got off here with almost no consequences whatsoever. Then on our side, we agreed that we would have to pay off all of our pre-Revolutionary War debts to Britain. So not only is England getting off pretty easy in regards to this treaty, it's going to cost us money, more than what England's going to have to pay, plus we have no guarantee that things are going to get better. But for lack of a better term, we did have a treaty, and we did avert a war with England. Now, the thing is, since these issues never really stopped and were never really resolved, this is going to come back to haunt America in 1812 when we have the War of 1812. So really this was, like I said, not a good treaty. Now, as a result of all of this, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, especially in the South, were furious. They were livid. Southern farmers would have to pay while the Northern merchants would get paid. And so again, you're starting to see the very beginnings of a sort of sectionalism or regionalism where you have the North and South really starting to, somewhat square off against one another. The Southern farmers are going to be upset with the Northern merchant class, and this is going to be an argument, a debate, a complaint, whatever you want to call it, right up through the Civil War. There is going to be the ongoing issue to the South as of the North making money at the cost of the South. So Jay's effigy was burnt in the street. So you basically had like a likeness of him made out of straw or whatnot, with a picture, painting of his face on it. Those were burned in effigy, basically expressing to the Federalists and to Jay in particular that they were pretty much done with this. They were almost expressing a willingness to have Jay hanged. But while this did have various portions of the nation, as I said, livid, we did avoid war, at least for a while. Now, at this time, you also have what's known as the Pinckney Treaty in 1795. This one is with Spain. Now, what we're finally going to get out of this is free navigation of the Mississippi River. Remember, we mentioned this before. Rivers were the highways of the day. They were the quickest way to get goods downstream. Now, of course, there was no real way to get back upstream unless you walked, but still in all, you did have that ability to actually move goods. Now, Spain had closed off our ability to use the Mississippi after the Revolution, but now we're able to start using it again. Okay, there is a large chunk of disputed territory in what would today be around the Florida Panhandle. Okay, that is now going to get worked out. Strangely enough, pro-British Jay Treaty that we just mentioned, that's what prompted Spain to be lenient in this treaty. Okay, Spain didn't want America to buddy up to their enemy. They didn't want England to have an ally in the United States. So because of the Jay Treaty, Spain looked at what was going on in North America and thought, all right, if we do this, then that's going to make sure that they're not 100% in England's camp. Maybe they will look favorably upon us. And again, you got to think about all of this, the geopolitics of the day, and today as well. It's like a giant chess game. You are constantly trying to think several moves ahead. But with geopolitics, you got to remember, it's not just two people playing the game. It is a multiple number of people. And as a result, you're having to really be juggling at the same time. The Pinckney Treaty was going to be a benefit to the United States because now we had access to the Mississippi once again. So all of this has been going on, and we're actually starting to see Washington's term wind down. Now, at this point in time, there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution talking about how long an individual could be president. Quite literally, if George Washington had desired, he could have stayed president every 4 years that he could get reelected until such time as he tired of the office or, passed away. But we're getting toward the end. Now, it was after Washington's second term, he decides to step down. This created the two-term precedent. There was nothing in the Constitution, as I said, that limited a president to 2 terms. But Washington had essentially said no honest man need be president more than twice. And so from that point forward, no one was elected president more than twice. Now, there were a couple of times where there was an attempt made. U.S. Grant looked at a possible third term, as did Teddy Roosevelt, trying to get a third term. But this precedent wasn't broken until FDR won his third term in 1940. And it would be after FDR passed away, we would actually go through and get the 22nd Amendment passed for the Constitution that limited a president to 2 terms. But this was just the power of George Washington, that when he stepped down saying that 2 terms was enough for anyone, from that point forward, we didn't go for more than 2 terms. Okay, I said before that George Washington set a number of precedents, and this was one of them. When Washington is getting ready to depart, he prepares his farewell address. And he warned against a couple of things. One of the things that he was concerned with was the rise of political parties. Okay, the framers had a great fear of factions, and there was this hope that the United States would survive as a nation without political parties. That didn't last long. But there was always the hope that we would not put so much emphasis on party that we would put one's political party over the good of the nation itself. And that really is what George Washington is warning against. He doesn't want anyone within the nation to consider their particular political party to be more important than the country itself. Second thing, he warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. Now, there is some debate on this as to whether or not Washington intended this to be something permanent, that he believed that the United States should never, under any circumstance, actually get involved in an alliance with any nation. I mean, let's be honest, the United States had already formed at least one treaty, one relationship with France back during the Revolution. So the question is this supposed to be permanent or temporary? One of the arguments I have read is that it was essentially saying this was just temporary until the U.S. got on its feet, that we weren't trying to get embroiled with European politics, that if we picked sides now, we would be pretty much sunk. That we quite literally didn't have the ability to stand up against any of the European powers, and that we should hold off on making any alliances until we were strong enough to stand on our own. The other argument is that Washington meant we should never, ever be allied with any other nation. And, as you read through Washington's farewell address, I leave that up to you as to which he intended. But Washington was leaving office. And the important thing was that as he left, he had set the U.S. on its feet. He had helped make the United States sturdy. 8 years after he had become president, he's going to step down. A move unprecedented for a leader to give up power in that way. Now, granted, in this case, it was giving up power to his vice president. John Adams was going to be elected as the next president, and so it wasn't that huge a change. But any change like this was unique in the world at the time. This was a point in time where leaders who had power did not give up that power. And as such, Washington doing so, what we now call the peaceful transition of power, was unprecedented at the time.